Hi, I'm Gary Kim, and I'm here today with Bill Barney, the CEO of Reliance Communications and also the CEO of GCX.
Yes.
One of the better known people in the entire conference, always have been. So I'm going to ask you a couple questions that relate to your core business first, and then we're going to go off script.
Wherever you want to go, Gary.
Okay, so traffic.
Traffic.
Big issue.
Booming.
Booming.
Probably, I think since 2000, like 1999, 2000 is probably the biggest growth we've seen in traffic globally in the last 24 months. So it's actually, you're seeing that with cable bills coming around the world. Obviously, we're building our next cable, but I would say demand is probably at its strongest point that it's ever been. And it's largely driven by cloud computing, but it's also 4G. A lot of wireless technology is driving that as well. So I think there's huge growth, and I think we've got a nice window of 2 to 3 more years of strong demand, I think, before supply actually catches up.
And most people are aware that you are heading one of the largest communications companies in India and have mobile as part of your portfolio.
Yes.
And mobile's really challenged in India. I think it's the toughest market in the world, frankly.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you're seeing in the Indian mobile market, and what might that mean?
Well, it's interesting. We're exiting the mobile market, so we've actually sold our tower assets, our spectrum, to Reliance Jio, and we're in the process of closing that deal. But I think the interesting thing that we learned was when you have a disruptive player in the industry and ARPU start to drop, which we saw in India, your CapEx per subscriber can go to a point where it's untenable actually to be in the wireless business. And it's something we saw for the first time, and you saw actually 4 operators actually close their doors in a market over the course of 12 months, which is pretty amazing. And is this a bellwether for the rest of the industry? I don't know, but it clearly showed that there's a point where wireless technology itself is not even viable. Even at 4G, when you're using fairly advanced technology with fiber towers, et cetera, there are still challenges. And I think that it's an industry that you're going to have to watch around the world. I think as smartphones start to move and the capital required to build out a data network in the wireless space, plus the cost of spectrum, which has actually been escalating every year with the auctions. So it's a challenging environment. I think India will be an interesting sample. Hopefully it's not where the globe goes, but I think it's a warning shot for the industry.
Now, in terms of the mobile business model, which is clearly challenged, I think ARPU is not only dropping, I think cash flows have gone negative for virtually all the carriers in India. Government policy always plays a role because spectrum, which is a resource you've got to have, has to be done there. What's the feeling in India about government making business harder or easier?
Well, I think India will have to rethink its regulatory environment. It'll have to think about its revenue share, how the government actually shares revenues with the telcos, but also spectrum. I think you're going to see for the first time, the spectrum's not necessarily going to rise in price, which is, we've seen over the last 20 years, spectrum auctions every 3 or 4 years are actually generating more and more cash flow. And governments, I think, have gotten used to that cash flow. And I think we're going to see that it's hard for operators in a very commoditized service to actually pay those types of fees for those services. So,
it's interesting. We globally started deregulating and privatizing the telecom industry in the 1980s, really got going towards the tail end of the decade. And we opened everything to competition, and we got more innovation, got more investment, and that's all great. But the one question we've never really talked about in public is what happens if in competition, as in any other market, winners are beaten by upstarts and that sort of thing? In other words, failure. What if the largest mobile carrier or the largest landline carrier in a country literally fails? What happens? Could it happen? What do we do if that happens?
Well, I think it's an interesting situation, because I think you also see the OTTs arriving, right, which are not necessarily putting up the same amount of investment as a traditional telco, and yet are still getting the services and the revenue that actually comes with a traditional telco. So I think that's one of the things that's also driving it. And I think in some of the small markets, they may actually drive the telcos out of business, and it may happen. It's not that far-fetched. you know, I think we're years away, and I think there'll have to be a lot of mistakes made by government regulators for that to happen. But reality is, it could happen, and it happened in 2000. You know, you think about it, how many bankruptcies were in 2000, and it was the same thing. It was actually voice traffic being converted to data traffic. It was essentially people coming on the internet, no longer using telephones for voice, and so the highest margin service of the telcos, which was voice services, and the lowest capex service was wiped out, and all of a sudden they had a high capital service that they had to provide data for. You're now seeing that this thing's rerunning itself again in the wireless space, and that just, you know, so are we up for another 2000? I don't know, but it's clearly it's a possibility, and I've watched it in India happen in a very, very rapid way, and it doesn't mean the industries will shake out and it'll adapt. And these industries are, you know, you got very good CEOs around the industry, which they'll tack and take the right direction, but you will see, I think, a reset happening, I think, over the next couple of years in the space.
Yeah, I've been talking with a Morgan Stanley analyst who covers Asia, and he actually believes that 10 or 15 years down the road, the telecom business, in fact, will not be viable for more than one entity in most of the countries, and whether that's government or private doesn't really matter. He says, listen, there's not enough revenue and profit to support any more than one carrier, and most countries have 4 or 5, 6 players if you count them all.
Yeah, no, and I think the other thing is that, you know, the same of the challenges that we felt in the 60s and 70s about getting rural communications so that you can actually bring the entire country up together. So not the 5 big cities in the country, but the 6 through 100 cities. How do you actually make sure that they have the infrastructure so that people can have education and services, and actually those economies come at the same time? And I think you're going to have that challenge again, because obviously it's very easy to build a city network for wireless. It's very difficult to build one out in the boondocks, in the agricultural places and smaller cities around the world. So it's going to be interesting. It's you know, many of the challenges seem to come back and repeat themselves.
Always.
But that's why we're here, and some of us actually have lived through both ends of it, right? So it's
maybe a couple times.
Yes. So the cycles we've been through it a few times.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Bill, fascinating as always. Thanks for being here with us.
Thanks, Gary. Good to see you.
And thanks for watching PTC TV.